Harrison. I'm really excited today to share with you a little bit about my new book, Big. Around the time I started working on my first book, Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History, I read a study from the Georgetown Law Center on poverty and inequality called Girlhood Interrupted. It was my first introduction to the term adultification bias, the perception that some children are more adult, more mature, more responsible and knowledgeable than their age would suggest. It is inherently racialized as it happens at a disproportionate rate with Black children and particularly Black girls. The study found that adults view Black girls as young as the age of 5 as less innocent and more adult than their white counterparts. This results in adults believing that Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, they need to be comforted less, they know more about adult topics, and the list goes on. When I read this study, I felt so emotionally wrenched because I remember being a very quiet, shy kid who took a long time to really come of age. I just thought about how harmful it is and could have been for me to be presumed old enough, mature enough for things I absolutely was not ready for simply because of the way adults perceive Black girls. I thought about the different metrics that feed into this bias, including skin color, height, voice, body shape, size, and weight. I feared for the girls who were being judged for being too something, too tall, too loud, too big. The suggestion that a kid should know better because they're too big for things felt so harmful. This intersection of adultification bias with anti-fat bias felt like something I needed to address in my work somehow. I wasn't pulling from a specific experience, rather, I felt compelled to make an appeal for Black girls and their innocence. I don't have that much power in this world, but if I could create characters that make people go, oh, and want to hug them and love them, I felt like I could help dismantle some of these biases that people may not even know they have. I'd been reflecting a lot on my body and feeling like I wanted to make art that spoke to self-love and confronting how anti-fat bias affected me. As a child, I internalized toxic ideas about my body, and honestly, I'm still trying to unlearn a lot of that now. Addressing anti-fat bias and adultification bias together made sense as they are both inherently linked and particularly racialized. Addressing all of these things in a picture book, however, was a huge challenge. I wondered if this was the right place for a story like this. But I know this book would have been really helpful for me as a young person and hopefully might help others. If Little Leaders spoke to the young girl in me who needed to know there are so many opportunities that exist for people who look like me, then Big spoke to the girl in me who needed to hear that her body was never a problem and that I deserved the opportunity to change and grow without judgment. The girl at the center of the story doesn't have a name. Her story is partially inspired by mine, but she's not me. I didn't want her to be any one specific person. I hoped to create a character that people could love and connect with. And I hoped the message could resonate on a universal level. I hoped that anyone could look at this girl's story and see a reflection of themselves in her, see someone they know, or simply empathize with her experience. This was always a very internal story. We stay inside of the main character's perspective for nearly the whole book. I wanted to focus solely on her feelings and emotional journey. With that in mind, I knew the compositions needed to be spare to let the quiet moments breathe. I tried to use layout and color and lighting to help communicate tone and story. I chose pink to be the color that represents her for a number of reasons. It's a symbol for innocence and sweetness, but also in color psychology, pink is associated with gentle love and care, something this girl deserves. And as the story flows, we see her pink color become saturated as she's growing and changing and figuring out who she is. We also see that color dim and disappear entirely in her lowest of lows. In the wordless spreads, we have just color and composition to help us feel what the character is going through. Eventually, the frame, trim size of the book become story elements as she starts getting boxed in. At the end, we see her make more space for herself. She's able to find a way out, and we see that pink color come back fully saturated. I thought for a long time about how to address the other people in the book. I decided to make them all this muted pink color, still within the same color family as her pink, because we're seeing them through her lens. None of them are fully rendered because, for me, they're suggestions of people, to emphasize that this is her story and not about her relationships with specific individuals, rather a society and culture that places biases and expectations on her. I've heard some people describing this book as one that's about body positivity. And while I do think body positivity is an important message, I want to push back on that a little bit. Often when people bring up body positivity, it suggests changing your individual mindset. If I can just change the way I think about myself, everything can be better. But that does not quite address what anti-fat bias is. It's not just about individual people being mean. Rather, it refers to institutional oppression, that is, systemic and pervasive mistreatment, discrimination, and prejudice against individuals and groups based on their body weight and size. These show up in different ways, from medical disparities to employment discrimination, and where this story takes place, social stigma and bullying. I use anti-fat bias here instead of fat phobia, as many fat activists have suggested. Phobias are real mental health disorders that need treatment and care. But hatred and prejudice against larger bodies is a learned bias. In order to dismantle hatred, we have to address it as such. This is a story about the words we use to one another, how sometimes those words can hurt and heal, how words are used to categorize children and label them. And we see what it's like to walk around in the world with other people's labels on you. Big is one of those labels, but it changes meaning throughout the book. I wanted to trace how it can go from a word of affirmation to a negative thing as a girl grows and changes. In the end, she reclaims it as just one of the things that describes her. Because this is a sort of meta topic, I wanted to play with the function of words throughout the book. Words of affirmation flow in hand lettering as the girl is growing and figuring out who she is. There are words in serif font that come from the people of authority in her life. We see how she internalizes those words and eventually hands them back. While I knew exactly what I wanted to communicate from the girl's perspective, everyone else was a lot more complicated. I didn't want this to be an indictment of adults, rather an appeal to consider the words we use with children and to see how our words can stick with kids. I felt particularly nervous about the scene with the teacher. I understand the desire to empathize with the teacher here. She's a teacher. Her job is probably super exhausting. She's likely overworked and underpaid and didn't think she was going to fall over on the playground that day. She's a good person and has the best intentions and wants only the best for her students. In the heat of the moment, she says something to the girl. "Don't you think you should know better? Don't you think you're too big for that?" The words impact the child almost literally on the page. Now you might say, "Oh, but she didn't mean it that way," or "You can't judge her for what she said in the heat of the moment." But what I want to call out here is, when you jump to defend the teacher, you're prioritizing the intent of her words over the actual effects of her actions. Often when we get caught up arguing about the intention behind someone's words, we forget the person who was actually affected. In this case, it is a child. I wanted to make sure her feelings are considered. As a kid, I got labeled as too sensitive, which always meant that when I got hurt by someone else's words, it meant that I was the problem. I heard this a lot from the people around me. The assumption was, I didn't mean to hurt you, so I couldn't have hurt you. This disconnect is what we see at the end. Some of the people just didn't get. They didn't offer this girl any care or nurturing. That's what this book is appealing for, her girlhood. In the final spread, the girl is alone. I think on an unconscious level, I needed to share that the journey to self-love is a personal one. I had conversations with my editor about how the girl gets there, about potentially needing another character or another conversation to achieve a clearer story arc. But to include other characters like parents or friends For me, it would be too easy to turn them into the heroes or villains of her story. In the end, she saves herself. It is a quiet, resolute thing that she eases into. She dances and moves her body unhindered, taking up space on the page. She is fully free within herself. It's a callback to the beginning of the book, because this girl, like all children, enter this world in a place of self-love. That freedom gets taken away from her. Amazingly, she finds her way back, but what I want for all children is to create a world where they are not dimmed or oppressed or boxed in by other people's labels and expectations. And even though I can't change the world, I hope this book might be a guide for kids or anyone who needs it to show them no one gets to define you. You get to decide who you are and what kind of person you will be.